My name is Clara Sterling. I am 28 years old, and for as long as I can remember, my family has viewed me not as a daughter, but as a bad investment. If you live in Silicon Valley, you probably know my family's name. My parents, Richard and Betty Sterling, are the founders of Vanguard Innovations, a tech conglomerate that builds the microprocessing infrastructure for half the devices in your home. Their corporate motto, plastered in bold silver letters across their glass-walled headquarters, is the classic tech bro battle cry, "Move fast and break things." They applied that exact same philosophy to their children. By the time I was 20, I realized I was the thing they had broken. I wasn't loud. I wasn't ruthless. I didn't want to disrupt industries or crush competitors. While my parents spent their evenings at $5,000 a plate networking galas, trying to squeeze one more drop of influence out of their peers, I was the girl sitting in the corner of the library, reading about the intricate, delicate mechanics of 18th century horology, the study of time. They called me unambitious. They called me an embarrassment. But mostly they called me the lazy dreamer. My younger brother, Carter, on the other hand, was their masterpiece. Carter is 25, wears $400 fleece vests, and speaks almost entirely in corporate buzzwords. Last year, my father handed him a vice president title and a $2 million salary for his birthday. Carter doesn't actually build anything, of course. He just walks into rooms, fires people who have been there for 20 years, and calls it optimizing synergy. While Carter was being groomed to inherit the Vanguard empire, I was quietly building my own sanctuary. I own a small, sunlit shop in a quieter part of the city called The Second Hand. It's an antique clock and vintage watch restoration business. When you walk through my door, the frantic, screaming chaos of the modern world disappears. It smells like cedarwood, brass polish, and specialized clock oil. And the sound, it's just the steady, rhythmic heartbeat of hundreds of ticking clocks. To me, a broken watch isn't trash. It's a history lesson. It's a puzzle waiting to be solved. I believe in moving slowly and fixing things. To my parents, my shop was a public humiliation. I remember a specific Sunday lunch, just a few weeks before everything shattered. Attendance at my parents' $15 million Palo Alto estate was mandatory. The house is a sterile monument to their wealth, all cold white marble, sharp edges, and floor-to-ceiling windows that make you feel like you're constantly on display. We were sitting at the long glass dining table. My mother, Betty, was picking at a microscopic piece of kale. She looked across the table at me, her eyes sweeping over my simple, comfortable sweater and resting on my hands, which bore a faint smudge of machine grease I hadn't quite been able to scrub away. "Clara, darling," she sighed, her voice dripping with that particular brand of wealthy maternal pity. "Are you still playing with those dusty little gears in that shop of yours?" "I'm restoring a 1920s Vacheron Constantin, Mom," I said quietly, keeping my eyes on my plate. "It's actually a very complex mechanism. It requires you to waste your potential," my father interrupted, not even looking up from his iPad. "Vanguard is weeks away from a $10 billion IPO, Clara. We are changing the future of global communication. And my eldest daughter is sitting in a strip mall, wiping dust off obsolete jewelry for minimum wage." Carter snorted, leaning back in his chair and swirling his sparkling water. "Come on, Dad, leave her alone. Not everyone has the killer instinct. Someone's got to fix the stuff we leave behind, right?" He offered me a patronizing smile. "You know, Clara, if you actually wanted to make real money, you digitize your intake process, offshore the actual repair work to cheap labor overseas, and just slap a premium heritage label on the front end. But you're too soft for that. You get too attached." I gripped my napkin under the table. Too soft. That was their favorite diagnosis for me. Because I believed in fair pricing, because I actually spoke to my elderly customers instead of rushing them out the door, because I cared about the integrity of the work over the profit margin, I was fundamentally flawed in their eyes. "Sentimentality is a tax paid by the weak, Clara," my father added, finally looking at me. His eyes were as cold and flat as the marble floors. "In the real world, you either eat or you get eaten. And right now, you look like an appetizer." I didn't argue. I had learned long ago that defending myself to the Sterlings was like trying to teach a shark to apologize. I just nodded, swallowed the lump of humiliation in my throat, and counted the minutes until I could escape back to my shop. I thought that Sunday lunch was as cruel as they could get. I thought the constant, low-level mocking was the worst of it. I didn't know that my parents had already drafted the legal documents to formally erase me from the family trust. I didn't know that my upcoming 28th birthday would be the day they finally pulled the trigger. But they didn't know something, either. They didn't know that my quiet little shop, the one they viewed as an embarrassing joke, was about to become the epicenter of their absolute destruction. They thought my kindness made me weak. They were about to learn just how dangerous a woman can be when she knows how to dismantle something piece by piece. If you think Thanksgiving is about gratitude, turkey, and family bonding, you've clearly never spent a holiday with the Sterlings. In my family, Thanksgiving is a performance review. That year, the performance review was held in the Great Hall, my mother's pretentious name for the main dining room. It was a cavernous space with 20-foot ceilings and a chandelier that cost more than my entire college tuition. The table was set for 30 people, but only 4 of them were actual family. The rest were investors, board members, and a few high-profile tech journalists my father was trying to charm before the IPO launched. I sat at the far end of the table, squeezed between a venture capitalist named Greg, who kept checking his Apple Watch, and a woman named Linda, who was the CFO of a rival software firm. I was wearing a simple navy dress I'd bought on sale, and I could feel my mother's eyes burning into the fabric from across the room. To Betty Sterling, wearing off-the-rack clothing was a moral failing. The air smelled of truffle oil and ambition. The conversation wasn't about what we were thankful for. It was about market caps, quarterly projections, and who was buying an island in the Caribbean. Halfway through the second course, a scallop foam that tasted like salty air, my brother Carter stood up. He tapped his spoon against his crystal champagne flute. The room went silent instantly. In the Sterling orbit, when the golden boy speaks, the world stops spinning. "I'd like to propose a toast," Carter announced, his smile bright and practiced. He looked every inch the tech visionary, his tailored suit hiding the fact that he'd never written a line of code in his life. To family, to vision, and to Vanguard Innovations hitting a $10 billion valuation when we ring that bell next month. A ripple of polite applause and murmurs of "here, here," went around the table. "We are standing on the precipice of history," Carter continued, his voice swelling with self-importance. "Our new processor architecture is going to make everything else obsolete. And sure, the tech blogs keep asking about the ghost in the machine, that anonymous holding company we license our core patent from, but let me tell you something." He paused for dramatic effect, looking around the room. "We own the future. The past doesn't matter. Whoever is sitting on that old patent is just a landlord. We're the ones building the skyscraper." My father, Richard, beamed. He raised his glass. "To the future, and to my son who is leading us there." The room erupted in cheers. I clapped politely, keeping my head down, hoping to remain invisible. But in a room full of sharks, blood in the water is impossible to ignore. "And Clara?" The voice belonged to Greg, the venture capitalist next to me. The table went quiet. Greg had a cruel, bored smile on his face. He'd clearly had too much wine and was looking for entertainment. "Carter is taking the company public," Greg said, loud enough for the entire table to hear. "What is the other Sterling sibling contributing to the GDP these days, still fixing cuckoo clocks?" A few people chuckled. It was a low, ugly sound. My face burned. "It's high-end horology restoration, actually," I said, my voice steady but quiet. "I preserve mechanical history. Some things can't be replaced by a microchip." My mother let out a sharp, dismissive laugh. It sounded like glass breaking. "Oh, Clara, please," she said, waving her hand as if swatting away a fly. "Don't bore the guests with your little hobby. We're discussing real business." "It's not a hobby, Mom," I said. The words slipped out before I could stop them. I usually never pushed back, but something about Carter's arrogance and the long day had worn my patience thin. "I run a profitable business. I have clients who trust me with heirlooms worth more than this table. There is value in taking care of things. there is value in patience." The silence that followed was heavy. My father slowly turned his head toward me. The warmth he had shown Carter just moments ago was gone, replaced by the icy stare that had frozen me out for 28 years. "Value," he repeated, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. "Let me explain something to you about value, Clara. Value is scale. Value is growth. Sitting in a dark room with a magnifying glass, tinkering with dead technology, is not value. It is nostalgia." He leaned forward, and the candlelight caught the hard lines of his face. "Carter is securing a legacy that will last for generations. You are dusting off trinkets that people forgot about 50 years ago. Don't confuse your sentimental little distractions with actual work." He turned back to his guests, dismissing me entirely. "Forgive my daughter. She has always lacked the killer instinct necessary for the real world. She prefers to live in the past." Carter smirked at me across the centerpiece. "Maybe after the IPO, I'll buy your shop, Clara," he teased. "Turn it into a server room, put it to good use." The table roared with laughter. 30 of the wealthiest, most powerful people in Silicon Valley were laughing at me. I sat there, gripping my fork until my knuckles turned white, forcing myself not to cry. I wouldn't give them the satisfaction. I took a sip of water, the ice clinking against the glass, a tiny, fragile sound against the roar of their egos. Let them laugh, I thought, a strange, cold resolve settling in my chest. Let them think I'm nothing. Let them think the past doesn't matter. They were so busy toasting the future, they didn't realize the irony. My brother had just bragged about the anonymous landlord they leased their empire from. They thought that landlord was a ghost. They thought the past was dead. They had no idea that the past was about to walk through the door of my shop and change everything. The morning after Thanksgiving, I opened my shop 2 hours early. I needed the sanctuary. My parents' laughter from the night before was still echoing in my ears, sharp and metallic. The hangover of their humiliation was a heavy, suffocating thing, but as soon as I unlocked the front door of the second hand, it began to lift. The air inside was cool and smelled of aged mahogany, brass polish, and the faint, sweet dust of history. I flipped the sign to open, turned on the warm amber lamps above my workbenches, and just listened. Hundreds of clocks, mantel clocks, grandfather clocks, delicate carriage clocks, ticked in perfect, unhurried unison. It was the heartbeat of my world. A world where things made sense. Where broken things weren't thrown away, they were understood. It was raining that morning, a cold, relentless Silicon Valley drizzle that kept the tech bros in their sleek glass offices. I was hunched over my workbench with a jeweler's loupe pressed to my eye, carefully reassembling the escapement of a vintage Omega when the little brass bell above the front door chimed. I looked up. Standing in the doorway was an elderly man shaking the rain from a faded tweed flat cap. He didn't look like the people who usually wandered into this part of town. He wore a worn, practical wool coat that had seen better decades, and he moved with the careful, deliberate stiffness of a man who had spent a lifetime carrying heavy, invisible burdens. "Good morning," I said, setting down my tweezers and wiping my hands on my apron. "Nasty weather out there. Come in, get warm. Can I help you find something?" He offered a soft, hesitant smile. His eyes, though surrounded by deep wrinkles, were strikingly sharp, a piercing, intelligent blue. "I'm not sure if you can," he said, his voice gravelly but gentle. "A jeweler down the street told me I'd have better luck finding a wizard than a watchmaker willing to touch this." He reached into his deep coat pocket and pulled out a small cloth bundle. He approached the counter and carefully unwrapped it, treating it with a reverence that immediately caught my attention. Inside the cloth lay a 1920s Patek Philippe pocket watch, or, at least, what was left of one. The crystal face was shattered, the gold casing was severely dented, and the delicate hands were bent out of shape. It looked as though it had been run over by a carriage, left in a drawer for 50 years, and then run over again. "My goodness," I breathed, leaning in. I didn't see the damage, I saw the tragedy of a beautiful machine silenced. I gently picked it up, feeling the cold, heavy weight of the gold. "What happened to it?" "Life," the old man said simply. "It belonged to my grandfather, then my father, then me. I was careless with it many years ago. Every specialist in the valley has told me the repair would cost more than the watch is worth. They told me to scrap the gold and buy a smart watch. He looked down at his weathered hands. They don't understand. It's not about what it's worth on paper. It's about the fact that it kept time for the men who built my life. It has a soul. My heart ached. This man was the exact opposite of my father. My father would have melted the watch down for a tax write-off without a second thought. They're wrong, I said firmly, looking up to meet his blue eyes. The people who told you to scrap it, they don't know the difference between price and value. The mainspring is likely snapped, and the balance wheel is shattered. I will have to custom mill replacement parts because Patek hasn't manufactured these specific gears since 1931. It will take me months. It will require an absurd amount of patience. I smiled at him, but I can fix it. The relief that washed over his face was profound. You would do that for a stranger? I'm Clara, I said, extending my hand. Arthur, he replied, taking my hand in a firm, warm grip. That morning was the beginning of the most important friendship of my life. Fixing Arthur's pocket watch became my passion project, and checking on its progress became Arthur's weekly routine. Every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon, the brass bell would chime, and Arthur would shuffle in, shaking off his umbrella or wiping his boots. I started keeping a kettle in the back room and a tin of loose-leaf Earl Grey tea, his favorite. We would sit at the small wooden table behind my counter. I would work on the microscopic gears under my magnifying lamp, and Arthur would sit across from me, sipping his tea and watching me work with a quiet, intense fascination. We talked for hours. For a man who looked like a retired schoolteacher, Arthur possessed a terrifyingly brilliant mind. He understood the complex mechanics of horology almost instantly. We talked about how the world had shifted from a culture of craftsmanship to a culture of consumption. Your generation, Arthur said one rainy afternoon, watching me carefully oil a gear no larger than a grain of sand, is obsessed with building things that run fast and die young. They write code that becomes obsolete in a year. They build phones designed to break. They think they are gods of innovation, Clara, but they are just building very expensive landfills. I laughed, thinking of my brother Carter and his empty corporate buzzwords. My family would vehemently disagree with you. They think the only direction that matters is forward. They think looking back is a weakness. Arthur's eyes darkened slightly, a flash of steel behind the gentle blue. A building without a deep foundation will collapse the moment the wind changes, he said softly. The men who run this valley, they lease their foundations. They don't own them. And one day, the landlord always comes collecting. I didn't understand the weight of his words then. I just thought he was a wise, observant old man who shared my disdain for the arrogant tech culture that had alienated me my entire life. I didn't know that Arthur was Arthur Pendleton. I didn't know that the code and foundations he was talking about were the literal patents that my family's $10 billion empire relied on to exist. To me, he was just Arthur, a man who listened to me, a man who saw the value in my patience. For the first time in my 28 years, I felt like someone looked at me and didn't see a disappointment. I thought I was just fixing his watch. I had no idea he was preparing to fix my entire life. Because just as my sanctuary was finally feeling safe, my 28th birthday was approaching. And my parents were preparing to deliver a blow so devastating, it would force me to decide, once and for all, if I was going to let them break me, or if I was going to break them back. I spent the morning of my 28th birthday doing something incredibly dangerous. I allowed myself to hope. For the first time in years, my mother had called me. She hadn't asked her assistant to email me, she had actually picked up the phone herself. Her voice had been uncharacteristically bright as she invited me to a private birthday lunch at the Oakmont Country Club. Just the family, Clara, she had said. It's a milestone year. We should celebrate. I should have known better. I should have recognized that in the Sterling family, invitations are just subpoenas wrapped in expensive stationery. But I was 28, and despite decades of evidence to the contrary, a small, stubborn part of my heart still wanted my parents to love me. I closed the second hand for the afternoon. I put on my favorite emerald green wrap dress, the one that made me feel confident, like I belonged, and drove my 10-year-old sedan past the wrought iron gates of the Oakmont. The valet, accustomed to parking Bentleys and McLarens, looked at my car with thinly veiled disdain. I didn't care. I walked up the sweeping limestone steps of the clubhouse, took a deep breath, and followed the maitre d' to the private dining wing. When he opened the heavy oak doors to the Wellington room, my foolish little spark of hope was extinguished instantly. There were no balloons. There was no cake. There weren't even menus on the table. Instead, my father sat at the head of a long, polished conference table. My mother sat to his right, perfectly composed in a beige Chanel suit. Carter slouched across from her, scrolling through his phone, and flanking my father were two men in dark, identical suits with briefcases open in front of them. Lawyers. "Ah, Clara, you're precisely on time," my father said, checking his Rolex. He didn't stand up. He didn't say happy birthday. He just gestured to the empty chair at the far end of the table, as far away from him as physically possible. "Have a seat. We have a tightly scheduled afternoon." I stood in the doorway, my hand frozen on the brass handle. The air in the room was so cold it felt brittle. Mom said this was a birthday lunch. My mother offered a thin, practiced smile. "And it is, darling. We ordered a lovely Niçoise salad for you. But with the Vanguard IPO launching in just a few weeks, your father and I realized we needed to handle some necessary housekeeping regarding the estate." I slowly walked to the chair and sat down. One of the lawyers, a man with hollow cheeks and dead eyes, slid a thick, leather-bound binder across the polished wood. It stopped right in front of me. "What is this?" I asked, though the dread pooling in my stomach already knew the answer. "It's a restructuring of the Sterling Family Trust," my father stated, his voice carrying the same flat, clinical tone he used to fire executives. "As Vanguard prepares to go public, our underwriters require absolute clarity regarding voting shares, equity distribution, and the line of succession for the family's assets." He steepled his fingers, looking at me as if I were a miscalculated spreadsheet. "To put it simply, Clara, having a significant portion of the family's wealth tied to someone who possesses no business acumen, no drive, and no involvement in Vanguard is considered a liability by our board. It's dead equity." The words hit me like physical blows. A liability, dead equity. "So," Carter chimed in, finally looking up from his phone with a smug, self-satisfied grin, "Dad's streamlining. He's formally removing you as a beneficiary of the voting shares and the primary estate." I stared at the binder. The gold-embossed letters on the cover blurred as my eyes stung. It wasn't about the money. I made my own living. I had never asked them for a dime since I moved out at 18. It was about what the document represented. They were legally, formally amputating me from the family tree. They were officially declaring that Carter was their only true child. "We aren't leaving you destitute, Clara," my mother interjected, her tone suggesting I should be falling to my knees in gratitude. "The new trust provisions include a modest, fixed monthly stipend for you, enough to keep your little clock shop running, even if it operates at a loss. It's for your own good, darling. You simply couldn't handle the pressure of real wealth. You're too soft. You'd give it all away." "Stick to your little hobby, Clara," Carter sneered, leaning forward. "Leave the empire building to the adults." I looked at the four of them, my family, the people who were supposed to protect me. They looked back at me with a mixture of boredom and irritation, waiting for me to just sign the paper and disappear back into my quiet, invisible life. They expected me to cry. They expected me to crumble, to apologize for being a disappointment, and to blindly sign away my birthright just to stop the bleeding. For 28 years, I would have done exactly that. But as I sat there, the smell of Arthur's Earl Grey tea suddenly drifted through my memory. A woman who knows how to fix broken things is far more dangerous than boys who only know how to buy them. I didn't cry. The tears burned hot behind my eyes, but I forced them down, locking them away in a place where my family could never reach them. I looked down at the silver pen the lawyer had placed next to the binder. I picked it up. My father nodded, a slight smirk touching his lips as he anticipated his final victory. Instead of signing, I placed the pen back down, perfectly parallel to the binder. I stood up, smoothing the skirt of my green dress. "I won't be signing this today," I said, my voice shockingly steady. My father's smug expression vanished, his brow furrowed in genuine shock. "Excuse me?" I don't sign legal documents without independent counsel, I replied, looking him dead in the eye. It was the first time in my life I hadn't broken his gaze. You can have your lawyers email a digital copy to my shop. I will review it on my own time, but I am not signing away my name between the salad course and the valet. Carter scoffed, but it sounded slightly uncertain. Don't be an idiot, Clara. You don't have a lawyer. Then I suppose I'll find one, I said. I picked up my purse and looked at my mother, who was staring at me as if a ghost had just spoken. Thank you for the birthday invitation, Mom, but I have actual work to get back to. I turned and walked out of the Wellington room. I didn't run. I kept my shoulders back and my head high, my heels clicking sharply against the marble floors until I reached the valet. I tipped the attendant, got into my 10-year-old sedan, and drove exactly 3 blocks away before I finally pulled over into an empty parking lot, put the car in park, and shattered. I gripped the steering wheel and sobbed until my chest physically ached, mourning the death of the family I never really had. They had finally done it. They had discarded me. I was completely, utterly alone, or so I thought. Because when I finally wiped my eyes and drove back to my shop, seeking the only comfort I had left, Arthur was waiting for me on the front step. And the confession I was about to make to him would set the stage for the greatest reckoning Silicon Valley had ever seen. For the next 3 days, I didn't leave my shop. I slept on the small, tufted velvet sofa in the back room, wrapped in an old Afghan, waking up every hour to the chiming of 50 different clocks. The lawyers from my father's firm had emailed the trust restructuring documents that very same afternoon. They sat in my inbox like an unexploded bomb, carrying the subject line, "Action Required, Sterling Estate Signatures." I couldn't bring myself to open it. Opening it meant making it real. It meant accepting that 28 years of trying to be a good daughter had amounted to a severance package and an eviction from my own bloodline. Instead, I poured every ounce of my shattered focus into Arthur's 1920s Patek Philippe pocket watch. Fixing it became an obsession. It was the perfect metaphor for my life, really. A beautiful, intricate system that had been violently crushed, deemed worthless by the experts, and left for dead. I spent hours hunched under the glaring halo of my magnifying lamp, barely remembering to eat or drink. I custom-milled the microscopic teeth for a ruined gear. I delicately realigned the bent gold hands. I sourced a piece of vintage crystal and polished it until it was practically invisible. When I finally set the new mainspring into place and gave the winding stem a gentle twist, I held my breath. For a terrifying second, there was nothing. And then, a sound. Tick, 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 tick. Fast, steady, and incredibly strong. The heart of the machine had started beating again. I slumped back in my chair and covered my face with my hands, letting out a long, shuddering breath. I had brought it back to life. I just wished I knew how to do the same for myself. It was Tuesday afternoon when the brass bell above the door chimed. I wiped my eyes, plastered on the polite, customer service smile I had perfected over the years, and walked out to the front counter. Arthur was standing there. He looked a little paler than usual, leaning slightly heavier on his wooden cane, but his sharp blue eyes were as bright and observant as ever. "Good afternoon, Clara," he said, his voice a warm rumble. Then his brow furrowed. The polite smile I was wearing didn't reach my eyes, and he noticed immediately. He looked at my pale face, the dark circles under my eyes, and the slight tremor in my hands. He didn't ask about his watch. He didn't say hello. He just walked up to the counter, looked me dead in the eye, and asked softly, "Who did this to you?" It was such a simple question. But the absolute, unwavering certainty in his voice, the immediate recognition that I had been hurt, broke the dam I had been desperately trying to hold together for 3 days. I'll put the kettle on," I whispered, my voice cracking. 10 minutes later, we were sitting at the small wooden table in the back room. 2 cups of Earl Grey tea steamed between us. I stared into the dark liquid, tracing the rim of the porcelain cup with my thumb, and for the first time in my life, I told someone the complete, unfiltered truth about the Sterling family. I told him about Vanguard Innovations. I told him about the $10 billion IPO and my father's ruthless obsession with scale and growth. I told him about Carter, the golden child who was handed the world on a silver platter while I was treated like a dirty secret. And then, my voice barely above a whisper, I told him about the country club. The birthday lunch that was actually a board meeting. The lawyers, the trust restructuring. They called me dead equity, I said, a single tear finally escaping and tracing a hot path down my cheek. My own father looked at me and told me I was a liability because I didn't have a killer instinct, because I care about things. They formally disinherited me, Arthur. They threw me away because I'm not exactly like them. I looked up at him, feeling utterly exposed and foolish. I expected him to offer pity. I expected him to pat my hand and tell me that money didn't buy happiness or some other empty platitude people use when they don't know what else to say. But Arthur didn't look pitying. He looked furious. It wasn't a loud, explosive anger. It was a cold, terrifying stillness. The kind of quiet that descends right before a massive storm breaks. He sat back in his chair, his hands resting on his cane, and stared at the wall for a long, silent minute. "Your father," Arthur finally said, his voice dangerously low, "is a man who knows the price of everything and the value of absolutely nothing. He thinks the world is a spreadsheet, and that people are just numbers to be deleted when the margins get tight." Arthur reached across the table and gently placed his weathered hand over mine. "You listen to me, Clara. Empathy is not a weakness. Kindness is not a liability. It takes no strength whatsoever to destroy something or to discard someone. Any fool with a hammer can shatter a window. But to build something, to protect something, to take something broken and painstakingly put it back together." He squeezed my hand. "That requires a strength your father and your brother will never comprehend." I sniffled, wiping my cheek with the back of my hand. "It doesn't feel like strength. It feels like I lost." "The game isn't over yet," Arthur said softly. A strange, almost mischievous light flickered in his blue eyes. I stood up, clearing my throat, and walked over to my workbench. I picked up the velvet pouch and brought it back to the table. "I finished it," I said, eager to change the subject. I gently slid the watch out of the pouch and placed it on the table between us. Arthur gasped. He picked up the shining gold timepiece, his thumb tracing the perfectly restored crystal face. He held it to his ear, closing his eyes as he listened to the strong, steady ticking of the resurrected mainspring. When he opened his eyes, they were shining with unshed tears. "My grandfather's heartbeat," he whispered. "You gave it back to me. I told you I could fix it." I smiled, feeling a genuine spark of pride cut through the misery of the week. Arthur reached into his coat to pull out his wallet, but I immediately shook my head, placing my hand over his. "No, absolutely not. This one is on the house, Arthur. Consider it a thank you for the tea and for listening to me today." He looked at me for a long time. It was a heavy, measuring look. He nodded slowly, slipping the watch into his inner coat pocket, right next to his heart. He stood up, leaning heavily on his cane, and walked toward the front door. As he wrapped his hand around the brass handle, he paused and looked back at me over his shoulder. "They think you're soft, Clara," Arthur said, his voice carrying a strange, prophetic weight. "But a woman who knows how to fix broken things is far more dangerous than boys who only know how to buy them. Remember that." The brass bell chimed, the door closed, and Arthur walked out into the crisp afternoon air. I went back to my workbench, feeling lighter than I had in months. I finally opened my laptop, found the email from my father's lawyers, and hit delete. I wasn't going to sign away my dignity for a monthly allowance. Let them fight me for it. I felt ready for whatever came next. What I didn't know, what I couldn't possibly have imagined as I watched Arthur's silhouette disappear down the street, was that those were the last words he would ever speak to me. And the next time I saw his name, it would be on a legal document that would bring the entire Vanguard empire to its knees. It had been exactly 3 weeks since I deleted the trust restructuring documents from my inbox. For 21 days, my phone had been a battleground. There were missed calls from my father's legal team. There were passive-aggressive text messages from my mother, warning me that throwing a tantrum would not change my father's mind. There was even a voicemail from Carter, who sighed heavily into the receiver before calling me an obstinate, dramatic child who was holding up a $10 billion IPO. I ignored all of them. For the first time in my 28 years, I was exercising the quiet, absolute power of simply refusing to participate in my own destruction. I found a strange, settling peace in my rebellion, but that peace was fragile, and on a rainy Sunday morning, it shattered entirely. I have always been an old soul. While people like my brother consumed their news through algorithms and 30-second sound bites, I still like to walk down to the corner bodega, buy the physical Sunday paper, and read it at my shop counter with a cup of tea. It was a habit Carter used to mock relentlessly. I was flipping through the back pages, the smell of newsprint mixing with the cedarwood of the shop, when my eyes caught the obituary section. I don't read it out of morbidity. I read it because I work with antiques. I understand that every life, every story, deserves the dignity of being witnessed at its end. I scanned the columns of black and white photos, and my heart abruptly stopped. The tea in my cup went perfectly still. I pulled the paper closer, my hands suddenly trembling. Staring back at me from the page were those sharp, intelligent blue eyes, the tweed flat cap, the gentle, knowing smile. Arthur Pendleton, 82. The air in my lungs vanished. I read the brief paragraph beneath his name over and over, hoping my eyes were playing a cruel trick on me. But the ink didn't change. It was incredibly brief, almost painfully so. There was no mention of a surviving wife. No list of children or grandchildren to carry on his memory. No grand life achievements or prestigious career highlights. It was just a date of birth, a date of death, and the location of a quiet graveside service scheduled for that coming Tuesday. A heavy, suffocating grief wrapped around my chest. I lowered the paper to the counter and pressed my hands over my face. I had just lost my biological family to their own greed, and now the universe had taken the one person who had stepped into that void. The only person who had looked at my quiet life and called it strength. He was gone. Tuesday morning arrived, bringing with it a bitter, biting wind and a sky the color of bruised iron. I flipped the sign on the second hand to closed, put on a simple black wool coat, and bought a single white rose from the florist down the street. I drove to the cemetery on the edge of the city, expecting to find a modest gathering. I assumed Arthur had friends from a retirement community, or perhaps a few other local shopkeepers who had enjoyed his quiet company and loose-leaf tea. What I found instead was jarring. There was a small green awning set up over the gravesite, protecting the polished mahogany casket from the drizzle. But beneath the awning, there were no grieving neighbors. There were no weeping relatives. There were only 5 men, and they did not look like they belonged in Arthur's world. They were dressed in sharply tailored, obscenely expensive dark suits. They stood with the stiff, calculated posture of men who spend their lives in executive boardrooms. None of them were crying. None of them were speaking. They just stood there, staring at the casket with a strange mixture of profound respect and nervous tension, like subordinates attending the funeral of a monarch. I felt completely out of place. I hung back, standing several yards away under my black umbrella, the cold wind whipping the hem of my coat. The priest spoke briefly, offering standard prayers for a man he clearly didn't know. I didn't listen to the words. I just closed my eyes and remembered the strong, steady ticking of his grandfather's pocket watch. I remembered the warmth of his hand over mine when he told me I was dangerous. "You gave me his heartbeat back," he had said. Tears, hot and silent, slipped down my cheeks, mixing with the cold rain. I felt a profound, aching emptiness. I was completely alone in the world again. When the priest finished, the 5 men in suits turned in unison and began walking briskly toward a line of sleek black town cars idling on the gravel path. They didn't linger. They didn't share memories. I waited until they were clear, then stepped forward under the awning. I laid my single white rose on the gleaming wood of the casket, letting my hand rest there for a moment. "Goodbye, my friend," I whispered into the quiet cemetery. "Thank you for seeing me." I turned to leave, pulling my coat tighter against the chill. But as I stepped out from under the awning, a shadow fell over my path. One of the men had stayed behind. He was tall, with silver hair perfectly swept back, wearing a charcoal suit that easily cost more than my car. He possessed the kind of tailored, intimidating presence that commanded a room before he even spoke. He stood blocking the path, holding a heavy black umbrella, his eyes locked onto me. "Miss Sterling?" he asked. It wasn't a question. It was a confirmation. I froze, my grip tightening on my umbrella handle. My first instinct was panic. Had my father sent someone? Had Vanguard's legal team tracked me down at a funeral to force me to sign the trust documents? "Yes," I said, my voice defensive and sharp. "If my father sent you, you can tell him." "I don't work for Richard Sterling." The man interrupted, his voice smooth and deeply resonant, though I am very familiar with him. He reached into the breast pocket of his coat and pulled out a thick, cream-colored card, extending it toward me. I hesitated, then took it. The card stock was heavy, the lettering embossed in minimalist black ink. Harrison Vance, senior partner. Vance, Montgomery, and Hayes. I stared at the card. They were one of the most ruthless, elite estate and corporate law firms on the West Coast. They handled billionaires, tech conglomerates, and old money dynasties. I looked up at him, my brow furrowed in deep confusion. Did you know Arthur?" "I knew him better than anyone," Mr. Vance said quietly. "I was his personal attorney for 35 years. My mind spun. Why did a sweet, lonely old man who wore a threadbare tweed cap and drank loose-leaf tea in a dusty clock shop need a corporate estate lawyer of this caliber? "I don't understand," I said. "Why are you speaking to me?" Mr. Vance looked past me, his eyes resting on the casket for a brief moment before returning to my face. "Because Arthur left very explicit instructions before he passed, Miss Sterling," he said, his tone dropping into a serious, formal register. "He requested your presence at the private reading of his will." "His will?" I echoed, completely bewildered. "But I'm not family. I only knew him for a few months. He was just a kind man on a fixed income." I fixed his watch. A tiny, almost imperceptible smile touched the corner of the high-powered lawyer's mouth. "Miss Sterling," Mr. Vance said softly, "Arthur Pendleton was a great many things, but a man on a fixed income was certainly not one of them. My car is waiting. I suggest you clear your schedule for tomorrow morning. Your life is about to change permanently." The offices of Vance, Montgomery, and Hayes occupied the top 3 floors of a gleaming skyscraper in the heart of San Francisco's financial district. It was the kind of building my father practically worshipped, a monolith of glass, steel, and untouchable wealth. As I stepped out of the private elevator on the 50th floor the morning after the funeral, I felt a familiar wave of imposter syndrome wash over me. I was wearing my best conservative blazer, but my shoes were scuffed, and my hands still bore the faint, stubborn calluses of a clockmaker. The receptionist, a striking woman sitting behind a slab of imported Italian marble, ushered me immediately into a sprawling corner conference room that overlooked the fog rolling over the Golden Gate Bridge. Harrison Vance was waiting for me. He stood at the head of a massive mahogany table, gesturing for me to take the leather chair opposite him. "Thank you for coming, Miss Sterling," he said, taking his seat. He folded his hands precisely over a thick, cream-colored manila folder. "I know this is highly unusual, but Arthur was a highly unusual man." "Mr. Vance," I started, my voice betraying a slight tremor. I folded my hands in my lap to hide it. "I don't want to waste your time. Arthur was a lovely man, and I cherished the afternoons we spent drinking tea in my shop, but there must be some mistake. I'm not family." I fixed his grandfather's pocket watch. That's the extent of our relationship. Vance offered a small, knowing smile. He reached into his briefcase and produced a familiar, worn velvet pouch. He slid it across the polished wood toward me. I gently untied the drawstring and tipped the contents into my palm. The heavy gold Patek Philippe watch rested perfectly in my hand, its resurrected heart ticking steadily in the quiet room. A fresh wave of tears pricked my eyes. "He left it to me," I whispered, tracing the pristine crystal face. "Thank you, this means the world to me." "He did leave you the watch," Vance said smoothly. "He wanted you to have a reminder of what you are capable of bringing back to life, but that is not why I asked you here, Clara." Vance opened the thick folder. He didn't look at the documents, he had clearly memorized them. He looked directly at me. "What do you know about the history of microprocessing?" he asked. I blinked, completely thrown by the pivot. "Nothing, really. My family's company builds the architecture for it, but I restore antiques. I leave the tech to them." 50 years ago, Vance continued, his voice taking on the cadence of a historian. Before your father ever incorporated Vanguard Innovations, a young engineer working out of a garage in Palo Alto solved a fundamental overheating problem in early circuit board design. He patented the architecture. As technology shrank, as computers went from taking up entire rooms to fitting inside our pockets, that foundational architecture became the bedrock of the modern tech industry. He paused, letting the silence stretch. That engineer never sought fame. He despised the ruthless, cutthroat culture that Silicon Valley became, so he buried his patents inside an anonymous holding company called the Aegis Trust. He licensed his technology out, collected the royalties quietly, and lived a simple life. The pieces were hovering in the air, but my brain refused to put them together. It was too massive, too impossible. Arthur, I breathed, my eyes widening. Arthur Pendleton, he was the engineer? Arthur was the sole owner and beneficiary of the Aegis Trust, Vance confirmed. My mind flashed back to the Thanksgiving dinner, to my brother Carter standing at the head of the table, raising a glass of champagne, boasting about Vanguard's upcoming $10 billion IPO. I remembered the venture capitalist asking about the ghost in the machine, the anonymous landlord who held the master patent Vanguard relied on to survive. We own the future, Carter had bragged. Whoever is sitting on that old patent is just a landlord. We're the ones building the skyscraper. Oh my God, I gasped, the air rushing out of my lungs. Arthur is the ghost in the machine. Vanguard, my family's entire empire, it's built on Arthur's patent. Correct, Vance said, leaning forward. Vanguard Innovations leases their core technology from Aegis. Without that lease, Vanguard cannot manufacture a single microchip. Without that lease, their $10 billion IPO is completely worthless. They would be bankrupt in 6 months. The room started to spin. The sweet old man in the tweed cap. The man who drank my Earl Grey tea and listened to me cry about being disinherited. He held the leash to the most vicious dogs in Silicon Valley. Arthur watched you, Clara, Vance said softly, his corporate veneer cracking just enough to show genuine warmth. He watched how your family treated you. He watched them discard you for lacking a killer instinct. And he watched you respond not with cruelty, but with grace, patience, and dignity. He saw you take something that the experts called worthless and painstakingly restore its value. Vance turned the folder around and slid it across the table. It stopped right next to the ticking gold pocket watch. Arthur had no children, Vance said. He spent the last 5 years terrified of what would happen to his life's work when he passed. He refused to let Aegis fall into the hands of men like your father, men who only know how to consume and destroy. He wanted to leave it to someone who understands the value of a deep foundation, someone who knows how to fix broken things. I stared at the paperwork. My name was typed at the top of the first page in bold, black ink. Declaration of Trust Transfer, Clara Sterling. As of yesterday morning, Vance stated, his voice ringing with absolute finality, you are the sole owner of the Aegis Trust. You possess absolute voting control over the patents. The intellectual property portfolio has been valued at approximately $120 million. I couldn't breathe. My hands gripped the edge of the mahogany table to keep myself from floating away. $120 million. But that is not the most pressing matter, Vance added, checking his own watch. Vanguard's master lease with Aegis expires in exactly 18 days. For the past month, Richard Sterling has been aggressively calling my office, demanding an emergency meeting with the anonymous owner of Aegis to renew the lease before their IPO goes public. Vance looked up at me, his eyes sharp and waiting. He's terrified, Clara. Your father knows that if the lease isn't signed, he loses everything. He has demanded an in-person meeting with the head of the trust to finalize the terms. Vance folded his hands. The question is, are you ready to grant him that meeting? I sat in the silence of the 50th floor. I looked at the legal documents that made me a centimillionaire. Then, I looked at the gold pocket watch resting beside them, ticking away with a steady, unbreakable rhythm. A woman who knows how to fix broken things is far more dangerous than boys who only know how to buy them. 28 years of being called a disappointment. 28 years of being told I was dead equity, a liability, a lazy dreamer. They had formally thrown me away just weeks ago. And now, my father was begging for his corporate life to a landlord he didn't know. I slowly reached out and picked up the gold pen resting on top of the folder. My hand wasn't trembling anymore. It was perfectly, terrifyingly steady. "Mr. Vance," I said, looking the high-powered lawyer dead in the eye, "please call my father's office. Tell him the head of the Aegis Trust will see him." In horology, there is a specific term for the moment a wound spring can no longer hold its tension. It's called the breaking point. If you push a mechanism too fast, too hard, and without proper care, the entire system doesn't just stop working, it violently rips itself apart from the inside out. For the next 2 weeks, I had a front row seat to the breaking point of Vanguard Innovations. I didn't have to be in their glass-walled offices to see it. The panic was bleeding out into the public. 3 days after I signed the Aegis Trust transfer documents, I was sitting in my shop, polishing the brass pendulum of a grandfather clock, when my brother Carter appeared on a prominent financial news network. I turned up the volume on the small TV I kept in the back room. The chyron beneath Carter's face read, "Vanguard IPO, the $10 billion question." Carter was wearing his signature fleece vest and a wide, blindingly white smile, but I knew my brother. I knew the micro-expressions of his arrogance, and right now his eyes were darting. He was sweating. "Carter," the anchor asked, leaning forward, "market analysts are highly bullish on the IPO next Friday, but there is a persistent rumor on Wall Street. Vanguard's entire microprocessing architecture relies on a master patent leased from an anonymous holding company. Can you confirm that the lease renewal is secure before Vanguard goes public?" Carter's smile tightened into a grimace. "Absolutely, David. Our relationship with our legacy partners is rock solid. We're in the final stages of synergistic paperwork. It's a complete non-issue. We are focused on the future." I muted the television, a cold, quiet satisfaction settling in my chest. Synergistic paperwork. He was lying through his teeth. 30 minutes later, the brass bell above my door chimed. Harrison Vance walked in. The senior partner of San Francisco's most ruthless law firm looked wonderfully out of place in my dusty, cedar-scented shop, but he seemed to enjoy the contrast. He walked over to the counter, carrying his sleek leather briefcase, and pulled out a stack of printed emails. "Good morning, Clara," Vance said, a distinct edge of amusement in his deep voice. "I thought you might want an update on the synergistic paperwork your brother is handling." He slid the emails across the glass counter. "As of 8 o'clock this morning, Vanguard's legal department has sent 12 urgent messages to my office. Your father has personally left me 4 voicemails." I looked down at the top email. It was from Richard Sterling. The subject line was entirely in capital letters. "Urgent, lease renewal escalation." He offered to double the annual licensing fee, Vance explained, pointing to a highlighted paragraph. $50 million a year, cash, to renew the patent lease for the next decade. When I formally rejected the offer on behalf of the Aegis Trust, Carter attempted to threaten us with a breach of contract lawsuit. I raised an eyebrow. "Can they do that?" Vance actually laughed. It was a sharp, predatory sound. "They can try, but as I reminded young Carter, their lease officially expired at midnight last night. They have no contract to breach. Every microchip Vanguard has manufactured in the last 12 hours is legally intellectual property theft. If I sneeze in the direction of a federal judge, Vanguard Innovations will be hit with an injunction that halts their entire global supply chain." I stared at the emails. For 28 years, Richard and Carter Sterling had operated with absolute impunity. They believed they were the smartest, most untouchable men in the world. They thought the rules didn't apply to them because they were the ones writing the checks. "What did my father do when you told Carter that?" I asked softly. "He panicked," Vance said, his eyes gleaming. "Your father stripped Carter of the negotiation and called me directly. He was practically hyperventilating. He demanded to know what the anonymous owner of Aegis wanted. He offered stock options. He offered board seats. He asked for a number, any number." I picked up Arthur's gold pocket watch from my workbench, feeling the steady rhythm of its heartbeat against my palm. "And what did you tell him?" "I told him exactly what you instructed me to tell him, Clara," Vance replied softly. I told him the owner doesn't want money. The owner wants a structural equity transition. I demanded 51% voting control of Vanguard Innovations in exchange for the patent rights. I closed my eyes, letting the gravity of that demand wash over me. 51%, absolute control, taking my father's empire out from under his feet. Did he accept? I asked. He had no choice. If word leaks that Vanguard lost its core patent, the underwriters will pull the IPO tomorrow morning. The company's valuation would drop to zero. Your father is trapped, Clara, and he knows it. Vance closed his briefcase with a sharp, decisive click. He has agreed to the terms, but under one condition. I opened my eyes. He wants the meeting. Vance nodded. Richard is a shark. He refuses to sign away half his company to a phantom. He demanded a face-to-face meeting with the new head of the Aegis Trust to sign the final paperwork and finalize the transition. He thinks if he can get you in a room, he can intimidate you, manipulate you, and force the terms down. When? Friday, 10 in the morning, inside Vanguard's executive boardroom. Vance looked at me carefully, assessing my nerves. Clara, you don't have to do this in person. I can act as your proxy. I can walk into that room, drop the papers on his desk, and handle the fallout. I looked around my beautiful, quiet shop. I thought about the thousands of hours I had spent here, fixing the things other people had carelessly broken. I thought about my mother's mocking laughter, Carter's cruel jokes, and my father's cold voice telling me I was dead equity. They had invited me to a country club just to throw me away. They wanted to see me break. No, I said, my voice as clear and calm as a ringing bell. I am not hiding behind a lawyer, Mr. Vance. Arthur didn't leave this to you. He left it to me. Vance smiled. It was a look of profound, immense respect. Very well, Miss Sterling. I will inform Richard that the head of Aegis will see him on Friday. When Vance left, I flipped the open sign to closed a few hours early. I had an errand to run. I didn't go home, and I didn't go to the bank. I drove to the high-end boutique district in Union Square. I walked into a luxury tailor that my mother frequented, a place where the associates usually looked at my scuffed shoes and ignored me. But I wasn't the invisible daughter anymore. I need a suit, I told the impeccably dressed associate who approached me. Navy blue, razor-sharp tailoring. I don't want to look like I'm attending a party. I want to look like I own the building. For the next 2 days, I prepared. I didn't practice a speech in the mirror. I didn't rehearse angry comebacks. I just kept my hands busy, oiling gears, winding springs, and listening to the steady, unstoppable march of time. My father had spent his entire life demanding that the world bend to his timeline. He was about to find out that his time was officially up. Friday morning arrived with a crisp, cloudless sky. At 9:45 a.m., I stood on the pavement outside Vanguard Innovations' global headquarters. The building was a towering monolith of smoked glass and steel, designed to make anyone standing at its base feel infinitesimally small. For my entire life, that was exactly how this building and the family inside it had made me feel. But not today. Today, I wasn't wearing scuffed shoes and a grease-smudged apron. I was wearing my bespoke navy blue suit. It fit like a second skin, a tailored suit of armor. Inside my breast pocket, resting perfectly against my heart, was Arthur's gold Patek Philippe pocket watch. I could feel its steady, rhythmic ticking, a reminder that time was finally on my side. A sleek black town car pulled up to the curb beside me. The back door opened, and Harrison Vance stepped out, carrying his signature leather briefcase. He took one look at me, his eyes sweeping over the sharp cut of my suit and the absolute calm in my posture, and offered a rare, genuine smile. You look like a woman who is about to collect a very large debt, Miss Sterling, he noted. I'm just here to check on my investments, Mr. Vance, I replied smoothly. We walked through the revolving glass doors and into the cavernous, white marble lobby. The security guards, accustomed to seeing me shuffle in through the side doors looking like the family embarrassment, barely recognized me. When Vance flashed his platinum legal credentials, we were immediately ushered to the private executive elevator. As the polished steel doors closed and we began the rapid ascent to the 50th floor, Vance looked at his watch. Just so you are aware, Vance said, his voice a low, calm murmur, I spoke with Richard's assistant 10 minutes ago. Your father, your mother, and your brother are all waiting in the boardroom. The underwriters for the IPO are on standby. Richard is apparently pacing a hole into the carpet. They are expecting a ruthless 80-year-old billionaire who doesn't speak English. They are completely off balance. Good, I said quietly. Let's keep them that way. The elevator chimed. The doors slid open to the executive suite. The air up here was thin and smelled of expensive espresso and sheer panic. Assistants were rushing down the hallways with iPads, their faces pale. When we approached the frosted glass double doors of the main boardroom, I could hear my father's voice bleeding through the heavy glass. I don't care what it takes, Carter. Richard was snapping. If this Aegis guy wants a seat on the board, give it to him. If he wants $50 million in stock, give it to him. We ring the IPO bell on Monday, or this entire company goes into freefall. Do you understand me? I know, Dad, I know. Carter's voice was uncharacteristically shrill, stripped of all its usual tech bro arrogance. Just let me do the talking. I can spin the synergies. You've spun enough, Carter. My mother, Betty, interrupted sharply. Just smile, nod, and sign whatever the man puts in front of you. I paused right outside the doors, taking one deep, centering breath. I pressed my hand against my jacket, feeling Arthur's watch tick. A woman who knows how to fix broken things is far more dangerous than boys who only know how to buy them. I pushed the heavy glass doors open. The boardroom was a massive, sterile expanse of chrome and white leather. At the far end of the 30-foot mahogany table stood my family. Richard was mid-pace, his tie loosened, his face flushed with stress. Betty was sitting stiffly, gripping a gold pen like a weapon. Carter was aggressively tapping his foot, his fleece vest looking suddenly ridiculous in the high-stakes room. When the doors clicked shut behind me, all three of their heads snapped up. For 3 agonizingly long seconds, they just stared at me. Their brains, wired to expect an anonymous, intimidating titan of industry, could not process why the family disappointment had just walked into their secured boardroom. Clara, my mother breathed, her perfectly manicured hand flying to her chest in shock. Richard's face darkened instantly, the panic morphing into explosive, ugly rage. What the hell are you doing here? He barked, marching toward the end of the table. Who let you up here? We are in the middle of a corporate crisis, Clara. I don't have time for whatever emotional tantrum you're throwing about the trust fund today. Carter scoffed, rubbing his temples. Unbelievable. Security is literally getting fired. Clara, get out. We have a meeting with the head of the Aegis Trust in literally 2 minutes. You are going to blow a $10 billion deal because you want to cry about your little clock shop. I didn't flinch. I didn't shrink away. I walked slowly, deliberately to the head of the table. I pulled out the oversized leather chairman's chair, but I didn't sit. I just stood behind it, resting my hands on the high back. I know you have a meeting, Carter, I said, my voice eerily calm, echoing in the cavernous room, and I'm exactly on time. Richard stopped dead in his tracks. He blinked, a flicker of profound confusion crossing his features. What are you talking about? Before he could say another word, the boardroom doors opened again. Harrison Vance stepped inside, setting his heavy leather briefcase onto the polished mahogany with a resounding thud. My father recognized him instantly. The blood drained from Richard Sterling's face so fast he looked like he might pass out. Harrison? Richard choked out, his eyes darting frantically between the ruthless senior partner and me. What? What is my daughter doing with you? Vance buttoned his suit jacket, his expression completely unreadable, a masterclass in legal execution. Richard, Betty, Carter, Vance said, his deep voice commanding the room with absolute authority. I am here in my capacity as senior counsel for the Aegis Trust, and I am here to formally introduce you to the sole owner, the primary beneficiary, and the absolute holder of the master patents your company requires to exist. Vance gestured elegantly toward me. Allow me to introduce Miss Clara Sterling. The silence that followed was not just quiet. It was a physical weight. It was the sound of a $10 billion empire crashing into a brick wall at 100 miles an hour. Betty dropped her gold pen. It clattered loudly against the wood. Carter's mouth opened, but no sound came out. He looked like a fish suffocating on dry land. My father gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning stark white. His eyes were wide, blown out with a mixture of terror and absolute denial. "No," he whispered, shaking his head. "No, that's impossible. That's a lie. The owner of Aegis is an old man, an engineer." "Arthur Pendleton passed away last week, Richard," I said softly, holding his terrified gaze. "You might remember him. He was the man whose life's work you were planning to steal when the lease expired. But Arthur was careful. He knew exactly what kind of men ran Vanguard Innovations. So, he left his life's work to someone he trusted to protect it." "This is a joke," Carter suddenly yelled, his voice cracking with hysteria. "Dad, this is a stunt. She's playing us. She fixes cuckoo clocks in a strip mall." Vance didn't even look at Carter. He simply opened his briefcase, pulled out the towering stack of notarized transfer documents, patent deeds, and court-certified trust papers, and slammed them onto the center of the table. "I assure you, Carter, my firm does not participate in stunts," Vance said coldly. "Miss Sterling is the legal and uncontested owner of the intellectual property that constitutes 94% of Vanguard's operational value. If she walks out of this room without signing a new lease agreement, Vanguard Innovations will be legally barred from manufacturing, selling, or licensing a single microchip by noon today. Your IPO will be dead before the market opens." My father slowly sank into his chair. He looked at the documents, then up at me. For 28 years, he had looked at me and seen a depreciating asset. He had seen a soft, useless, lazy dreamer. But right now, looking at me standing at the head of his boardroom in my tailored suit with his entire legacy resting in the palm of my hand, he finally saw me, and he was absolutely terrified. "Clara," my mother whispered, tears welling in her eyes, her voice trembling with a sudden, desperate affection she hadn't shown me since I was a toddler. "Clara, darling, you wouldn't do this to us. We're your family." I looked at the three of them. I thought about the birthday lunch, dead equity, a liability. I thought about them formally disinheriting me without a second of hesitation. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just reached into my pocket, pulled out the gold Patek Philippe watch, and set it on the table. The loud, steady tick-tick-tick echoed in the silent room. "You're right, Mom," I said, my voice carrying the quiet, unbreakable strength of a woman who knew exactly what she was worth. "You are my family, which is why I'm going to teach you how to fix what you broke." I looked down at my father. "Now, let's talk about my company." The silence in the boardroom was so absolute I could hear the microscopic gears of Arthur's pocket watch ticking against the mahogany table. My father was the first to break. The shark instinct in him, honed by decades of corporate warfare, tried to instinctively regain control of the room. He let out a breathless, forced laugh, running a hand through his silver hair. "Clara, sweetheart," Richard said, his voice dripping with a sudden, sickeningly sweet affection. He walked slowly toward me, holding his hands up like he was trying to calm a startled horse. This is a remarkable surprise. Truly, you played this very close to the chest. I always knew you had a strategic mind hidden away in that shop of yours." I didn't blink. I just watched him scramble. "Let's not let lawyers complicate family business," Richard continued, gesturing dismissively at Harrison Vance. "If Arthur left you the trust, that's wonderful. It stays in the family. Let's draft a buyout. I'll cut you a personal check for $50 million right now. You can expand your shop. You can buy a house in Carmel. You'll never have to work another day in your life." "I like my work, Dad," I said quietly. $100 million then," he countered instantly, sweat beading on his forehead. $100 million cash today. Just sign the master patent over to Vanguard." "You don't understand, Richard," Vance interjected, his voice like cracking ice. "Aegis is not for sale. Miss Sterling is not here to cash out. She is here to restructure." Carter finally snapped. The golden boy, the 25-year-old vice president of a company he didn't know how to build, slammed his hands onto the table. "Restructure?" Carter yelled, his face flushing dark red. "Are you insane? She fixes clocks. She doesn't know the first thing about global supply chains or microprocessing. Dad, you can't let her do this. We're going public on Monday. She's going to tank the entire valuation because she has a chip on her shoulder." I turned my head and looked at my brother. For my entire life, I had shrunk away from his loud, aggressive arrogance. But looking at him now, I didn't see a tech visionary. I just saw a spoiled, frantic little boy who was terrified of losing his allowance. I know enough about microprocessing to know that your entire architecture is built on a foundation you don't own, Carter. I said, my voice never rising above a calm, conversational volume. And I know enough about business to know that you fired 300 loyal employees this year to pad your own quarterly bonus. You don't build anything. You just strip it for parts. Carter opened his mouth to scream something back, but I held up a single finger. The authority in that tiny gesture was so absolute, it silenced him instantly. Mr. Vance, I said, keeping my eyes on my family, please outline the terms of the new lease. Vance opened a leather folder and slid 3 thick, stapled contracts across the table, one for my father, one for my mother, one for Carter. In order to renew the master patent lease and allow Monday's IPO to proceed, Vance read, his voice ringing with absolute finality. The Aegis Trust requires the immediate transfer of 51% of Vanguard Innovations' voting equity to Clara Sterling. She will become the majority shareholder and chairman of the board. My mother let out a small, strangled gasp. Richard looked like he had been physically struck. 51%. You're taking my company. I'm securing my foundation. I corrected him. Furthermore, Vance continued, ignoring them. Carter Sterling will step down as vice president, effective immediately. He will be reassigned to a junior project management role, commensurate with his actual experience at a standard market salary. I'll quit, Carter shouted, his voice cracking. I'll walk out that door right now. That is your choice, Carter, I said softly. But there won't be a multi-million-dollar trust fund to catch you this time, because the third condition of this agreement is that Richard and Betty Sterling will be placed on a strict, board-monitored financial allowance. No more treating Vanguard's accounts like a personal piggy bank. You vindictive little, Richard snarled, taking a threatening step toward me. Harrison Vance stepped smoothly between us, but I didn't even flinch. I just looked at my father with the same cold, clinical detachment he had shown me on my 28th birthday. A few weeks ago, I said, my voice cutting through the heavy air, you sat me in a country club and told me I was dead equity. You told me I lacked a killer instinct. You told me that in the real world, you either eat or you get eaten. I picked up Arthur's gold pocket watch from the table and slipped it back into my breast pocket, right over my heart. You were wrong, Dad. I don't want to eat you. And I don't want to destroy Vanguard. That's what a shark does. That's what you would do. I leaned forward, resting my hands on the leather chair. I am a restoration expert. I am taking 51% of this company so I can fix the rot you've let settle into its foundation. You can sign the papers, ring the bell on Monday, and keep your legacy intact, or you can refuse and I will let the patents expire at noon. Your choice. I looked at the clock on the boardroom wall. It is 11:40. You have 20 minutes to decide what your legacy is worth to you. Richard Sterling stood trembling. He looked at his wife, who was quietly weeping into a tissue. He looked at his golden boy son, who was pacing like a caged animal. Then he looked at the contract. He knew I wasn't bluffing. I didn't need Vanguard. I had my shop. I had my peace. I had everything I had ever wanted. He was the one with everything to lose. Slowly, heavily, like a man aging 10 years in 10 seconds, Richard picked up the gold pen Betty had dropped. His hand shook as he signed his name on the dotted line, officially handing over the keys to his empire to the daughter he had thrown away. Carter threw his pen across the room and stormed out, slamming the glass doors behind him. My mother signed without looking at me. When it was done, Vance collected the documents, checking the signatures with clinical precision. He nodded at me. It is executed, Madam Chairman. I didn't gloat. I didn't cheer. I just felt a profound, deep sense of closure. The heavy, suffocating weight of my family's expectations had finally been lifted. Mr. Vance will be your direct liaison moving forward, I told my parents, turning toward the door. He will oversee the board transitions and the IPO. If you need me, I'll be at my shop. I have a backlog of repairs to get to. Clara, my father called out, his voice hoarse, stripped of all its usual power. I paused at the door, looking back over my shoulder. He looked incredibly small sitting in that massive leather chair. Why? He asked, genuinely bewildered. You have $120 million. You own Vanguard. Why in God's name are you going back to a dusty antique shop? I smiled, a real, genuine smile. Because, Dad, I said softly, some things are actually worth my time. I walked out of the glass building, into the bright, crisp San Francisco afternoon. I didn't look back. I got into my 10-year-old sedan, drove back to my quiet neighborhood, and flipped the sign on the second hand to open. I am 30 years old now. Vanguard Innovations went public, and under my board's direction, we restored the pensions my father had cut and ousted the toxic executives Carter had hired. My parents live comfortably on their allowance, though my mother still complains about having to fly commercial. We don't speak much, but the silence between us is finally peaceful. Most days, you won't find me in a boardroom. You'll find me sitting under the warm amber light of my magnifying lamp, smelling of cedarwood and brass polish, surrounded by the steady, beautiful heartbeat of hundreds of ticking clocks. Arthur was right. A woman who knows how to fix broken things is dangerous. But more importantly, she is free. Thank you so much for listening to my story. If you've ever been the black sheep of your family, or if you've ever been told that your kindness is a weakness, I want you to remember Clara's story. Don't let cold, arrogant people convince you that your heart is a liability. Your empathy is your greatest asset. If you loved this story of dignified revenge and ultimate vindication, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment down below telling me your favorite part. Have you ever had to stand up to toxic family members? Let's talk about it in the comments. Until next time, stay strong, stay kind, and remember, time is always on your side.